We've all seen what's going on in the world. There's a certain person in office in the US, climate change is a pretty big deal, the UK is in a whole mess of its own, and that's to say nothing about Canadian politics. I know it's a lot to care about, but I'm about to give you one more. Hi, as was said, my name is Morikawa. I'm a fifth-year student at the University of Ottawa studying conflict and human rights with a minor in Indigenous Studies. Ottawa is also where I co-founded and am co-chair of the Indigenous Ally Network. I'm from Burlington, Ontario, on traditional Haudenosaunee territory. This event is taking place on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. It's important to remember, however, that it's not enough to merely note the nation whose land you're on. That's like stealing someone's water bottle and saying, "I'm not going to give this back to you, but I recognize that it was yours." Indigenous allyship and solidarity must extend beyond the initial recognition of a land acknowledgement. And that's what I want to talk about today. What is allyship? And why does allyship matter? I'm sure you've all heard the term a lot, particularly around issues affecting LGBTQ+ people. It's bandied about on social media, in activist circles, in op-eds, and in Twitter bios, including my own. The premise of allyship is fairly common, no matter the cause. Generally, being an ally isn't a one-stop identity marker after you've signed a petition, but a lifelong process of learning and building relationships. The way I've approached allyship has been to use my privilege, not to speak for another group, but to make space, to amplify and value their voices. Allyship to me is about providing support, whichever way, shape, or form that I can, and in a manner that the community needs. The Ottawa Indigenous Ally Network was established with this in mind. Now, I am not Indigenous, and so I do not experience the systemic and individual racism, the intergenerational trauma, and the effects of colonialism that Indigenous people in Canada do every day. My lived experience is quite different, and so I cannot possibly hope to speak for Indigenous people. Rather, I have the privilege that comes from being a settler, from being able to go to university, from being mostly white, from being straight and cisgendered, from being able-bodied. Through these forms of privilege, I am given, through no earned achievement of my own, access to opportunities and platforms that others are not. And as a result, I feel the responsibility to use said privilege until it no longer exists. In the fall 2018 semester, I took an Indigenous Studies course with one of my favorite professors, Tracy Coates, that required a volunteer placement. A few other students and myself signed up to try to organize allies at Ottawa to support Indigenous staff, students, and faculty, and to raise awareness of issues affecting Indigenous people. After months of conducting research and what felt like 100 meetings, we eventually formed our mission statement, proposed structure and goals, and held our first meeting. After the semester was over and organizing this group was no longer a part of our official grade, another group member and I decided to try to keep it going. In the fall 2019 semester, we had an executive team, an active social media presence, and a lot of motivation to do good for our community. This past semester, we've created and shared content, such as allyship tips of the week and breakdowns of political parties' Indigenous platforms ahead of the federal election. We ran awareness campaigns, such as promoting culturally appropriate Halloween costumes. And over the holidays, we ran an event to send food and item donations to Northern Inuit communities in need, and we have a lot more coming up. Indigenous allyship at the Indigenous Ally Network is premised on these ideas of making and respecting space. We try to use our privilege to make space for Indigenous voices and concerns to be raised and heard. We try to engage with and support issues that Indigenous people and groups have identified as important. We try to recognize and respect spaces that are not our place to enter. As with any form of allyship, it begins with learning the history and the terminology involved. This is also true, if not even more true, of Indigenous allyship. Now, I do not have the time or the expertise to delve into the long and ongoing history of colonialism in North America, but there are some basic concepts that it's important to understand. It's important to recognize that Canada is fundamentally a settler colonial country, not just in the past, but also in the present. Through historical events, we've seen settler colonialism. When settlers and explorers killed, kidnapped, and enslaved Indigenous people, when settlers manipulated nations into signing treaties in order to take their land, formed on stolen land, and hundreds of Indigenous nations were deemed a problem in need of a final solution. When governments and churches created residential schools in order to address the so-called Indian problem, by taking children away from their communities, teaching them that their culture is wrong, and in many cases subjecting these children to the worst forms of abuse. Residential schools in Canada only ended in 1996, 1 year before I was born. Settler colonialism was and is a tool used to try to eradicate a people in order to profit from their land. We still see this. When natural resource companies have more rights than Indigenous nations do to their own territory, when thousands of Indigenous women and girls go missing and are murdered and the police don't raise a finger, when reserves across the country still don't have access to clean water, even those that are half an hour away from major cities, when First Nations children represent 7% of the national population of children under 14, but are 52% of those in foster care, when a national police force that was literally created to remove Indigenous children from their home sanctions the lethal use of force against Indigenous protesters, when the Prime Minister of Canada decides to take Indigenous children to court. These are just a few examples of the realities that Indigenous people face because of past and ongoing policies of settler colonialism. Now, all of this is not your fault or my fault, and no one is suggesting that it is. We didn't create residential schools. We don't necessarily need to feel personal guilt for these things. But as settlers, we do benefit from settler colonialism. Whether your family came here in the 1800s or you're a first-generation immigrant, we do benefit. The circumstances are, of course, very different, but we all reside on Indigenous land, and so we should feel responsible to do something about it. Through my university career and through learning about Indigenous allyship through the Indigenous Ally Network, I had the opportunity to learn a lot, and I'd like to share this with you in order to help us all move forward in this. I learned that the history of settler colonialism in Canada is extremely long and complicated. There's so many issues to take into account, from historic to legal to social to economic to health related. And seeing as Indigenous people are not one monolithic group, but are hundreds of very different communities and nations, there are so many different views on any particular issue. And so one thing I've learned has been to never stop learning. There is so much information out there, from movies and books to documentaries to journals, articles, or Facebook posts and Twitter threads, if that's more of your thing. Imagine someone trying to be a teaching assistant at a university physics class based on a familiarity with Einstein. That TA would be more of a hindrance than a help, wouldn't they? And it's the same with allyship. In order to help, we first have to know what the issues are and why. Otherwise, that's just another person that Indigenous people have to educate. And once allies have learned, we can then go and teach others. This brings me to another thing I've learned, which is to not be a burden. While it's very tempting, and I've had to stop myself many times from asking an Indigenous person I know to help me out or to answer my many questions, it's important to keep in mind that there are many others asking them the exact same thing. There's nothing wrong with asking for help, but it's a good rule of thumb to think to yourself first, is this information I can find myself? It's kind of like when you ask your mom to look something up for you and she asks you why you can't Google it yourself. A lot of the Indigenous professors, academics, and activists you'll see are extremely busy with their own projects. And so it's important to at least try to find the information to your questions on your own first. There are so many things about Indigenous allyship that I could go on forever about checking our privilege and remaining humble and thinking about the language you use and not being culturally appropriative and learning how to change and adapt when you make a mistake. But perhaps the most important things I've learned have been to listen and to take a stance. I found that an ally that doesn't listen to the group they're trying to help is not a very useful ally. We all have our own ideas about what's important and how to go about doing things. But as allies, we have to recognize that we are here to help, and we can't effectively help if we don't listen to what others think and need from us. And further, it's vital to take a stand. I mean, is a neutral ally really an ally at all? In social spaces, when a friend says something problematic, in political spaces, when we're wondering who to vote for, and in personal spaces, when we're questioning our own assumptions and biases. It's essential for allies to take a stand. It's necessary and important to do the research and learn about the issues. But as allies, we have to go farther than that. We have to use what we learn to challenge ourselves and those around us to do better, to decolonize, or nothing is going to change. So, what are a few key takeaways about Indigenous allyship? What are some concrete things that you can do when you leave here today? Number one, go read, listen to, or watch something. A podcast about reconciliation, a documentary about the Oprah crisis, an article explaining the history of residential schools, a book about the Indian Act. Go consume some content in whichever way works for you that will teach you something about issues affecting Indigenous people that you didn't know before. Number two, listen. Listen when Indigenous people talk about the issues that are most important to them. Listen when they ask for support. Listen to how they ask for support. Listen not with the goal of responding, but with the goal of understanding. And number passive. Don't let friends or family say discriminatory things without speaking up. Don't vote for the people who want to keep the colonial status quo. Call out those who wear sexy native Halloween costumes. Email your MP about what's bothering you. Share what's happening in the news with your friends. It isn't always easy, and these are skills that I'm still working on, but they're important ones to develop. Now you have heard, and you will hear, a lot of really cool ideas today. But if you remember anything, I hope you remember this. That while Canada is a great place to live in for many of us, it is not like this for everyone. There are serious issues with how Canada treats Indigenous people, and there are things that we can do about it. As allies, we can use our privilege for the better. I feel that once we know what the issues are, it becomes up to us to act on it. To paraphrase Thomas King, a Cherokee writer from his book, The Truth About Stories, take this story for instance. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Make it the topic of a discussion group. Put it on the web. Forget it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now. Thank you.